The autumn evening was winding down, streetlights casting long shadows across Pine Avenue as Officer Richard Chen sat in his patrol car, finishing up his coffee. After 15 years on the force, he developed a routine. Same corner, same coffee shop, same time, every evening. But this night would be different. This night would change everything. Chen noticed a sleek black Mercedes making a turn without signaling. It was a minor infraction, the kind he might normally let slide, but something about the car caught his attention. Maybe it was the tinted windows, or perhaps it was just the end of a long shift getting to him. Either way, he flicked on his lights and pulled out onto the street. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, no hesitation. Chen approached the driver's side, flashlight in hand, his boots crunching on scattered autumn leaves. The window rolled down to reveal a well-dressed black man in his late 40s, wearing a crisp navy suit that probably cost more than Chen's monthly salary. "License and registration," Chen said, his voice carrying that practiced authority all officers develop over time. The man reached slowly for his glove compartment, maintaining eye contact with Chen through the side mirror. "Officer, I was just heading home from a meeting. Did I do something wrong?" The man's voice was calm, educated, carrying a quiet confidence that somehow got under Chen's skin. It had been a rough week. Budget cuts at the department, his divorce papers finally going through, and his kid's college tuition weighing heavy on his mind. "Turn signal. You didn't use it back there." Chen's words came out sharper than necessary. Something about this man's composure made him feel small, defensive. "I apologize if I didn't signal, but I'm certain I did." The man's tone remained level, reasonable. He held out his license and registration with steady hands. Maybe it was the man's certainty. Maybe it was the expensive suit, or the way he sat there so composed, while Chen's own life felt like it was falling apart. Whatever it was, something snapped inside Chen. Words tumbled out, each one harsher than the last. The situation escalated quickly, a raised voice here, a flash of anger there. The man stepped out of his car, still maintaining his dignity, still maddeningly calm. He stood eye to eye with Chen, not aggressive, just present. "Officer, I understand you're upset, but this isn't professional conduct." That word, professional, it was the match that lit the fuse. In a moment that would replay in Chen's mind countless times in the months to come, he did the unthinkable. Without warning, without thinking, he spat. The glob of saliva landed on the man's perfectly pressed suit jacket. Time seemed to freeze. A car passed by, its headlights illuminating the shock on both men's faces. Chen felt his stomach drop, the reality of what he'd just done crashing over him like a cold wave. The man simply looked at his jacket, then back at Chen, his eyes carrying not anger, but something worse. Disappointment mixed with resignation, as if he'd seen this all before. "You'll be hearing about this," the man said quietly, taking out his phone and recording Chen's badge number. He got back in his car with the same measured movements he'd shown throughout the encounter. As the Mercedes drove away, Chen stood rooted to the spot, his flashlight beam shaking slightly in his trembling hand. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow morning would bring the most shocking revelation of his career. For now, he just stood there, the weight of his actions settling over him like the darkness that crept across the evening sky. The next morning arrived with the harsh brightness of fluorescent lights in the police department's main conference room. Officer Chen slouched in his chair, nursing his second cup of coffee, trying to push away thoughts of last night's incident. Around him, his fellow officers chatted about weekend plans and recent arrests, their voices creating a familiar morning buzz. Lieutenant Wilson stood at the front of the room, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. "Morning, everyone. Before we get to daily assignments, I have an important announcement." He gestured toward the door. "Please welcome your new police chief." The door opened, and Chen's coffee cup nearly slipped from his fingers. Walking into the room was the man from last night, the same man he'd spat on just hours ago. The expensive navy suit had been replaced with an equally impressive charcoal gray one, but there was no mistaking that face, those steady eyes. "Good morning," the new chief said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had the night before. "I'm Police Chief Robert Washington." The room erupted in polite applause, but Chen couldn't move. His palms grew sweaty, and he felt the blood drain from his face. A few seats away, his partner noticed his reaction and shot him a questioning look. Chief Washington began speaking about his vision for the department: community engagement, transparency, accountability. But Chen barely heard the words. His mind raced through possible scenarios, each worse than the last. His career, his pension, his reputation. Everything he'd built over 15 years could vanish in an instant. As the chief continued his speech, his eyes swept across the room, eventually landing on Chen. There was a brief pause, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But Chen saw it. He saw the slight tightening around the chief's eyes, the smallest shift in his stance. After the meeting, officers filed out, many stopping to introduce themselves to their new chief. Chen tried to slip away quietly, but he'd only made it halfway to the door when he heard it. "Officer Chen, a moment, please." The remaining officers glanced between them curiously as Chen turned back. Soon, it was just the two of them in the conference room. The silence stretched out, heavy with unspoken words. "Sir, Chen began, but the chief held up a hand. "In my office," Washington said, his tone giving away nothing. The walk to the chief's office felt like the longest of Chen's life. Each step echoed in the hallway, marking time until what he was sure would be the end of his career. He noticed the nameplate was already on the door: Chief Robert Washington in fresh gold lettering. Inside the office, Washington didn't sit behind his desk. Instead, he leaned against it, arms crossed, studying Chen with those same steady eyes that had watched him through the car window the night before. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Washington asked finally. Chen's throat felt dry. "Sir, I know no apology can make up for what I did. It was inexcusable. I'm prepared to face the consequences." Washington nodded slowly. "You're right. It was inexcusable." He moved to look out the window, hands clasped behind his back. "But I've reviewed your file. 15 years of service. Generally good record. A few complaints, but nothing major until now." He turned back to face Chen. "I could fire you. Everyone would understand if I did. Some would probably expect it." He paused, and Chen held his breath. "But I don't believe in throwing away 15 years of experience without at least trying something else first." Chen blinked, confused. This wasn't how he expected the conversation to go. "You're on probation," Washington continued, "and you'll be going through our new sensitivity training program. Consider this your one chance, Officer Chen. I suggest you take it seriously." Chen stood there, stunned by this unexpected turn of events. The weight of shame, relief, and gratitude crashed over him all at once. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." As he left the office on shaky legs, Chen realized this wasn't just a second chance at his career. It was a chance to face something in himself he'd been avoiding for far too long. News of Chief Washington's decision spread through the department like wildfire. Officer Chen felt the stares and whispers follow him everywhere. Some officers wouldn't even look him in the eye anymore, while others made their disapproval known with sharp comments under their breath. "Can't believe he's still here," Chen overheard one rookie tell another in the break room. He kept his head down, stirring his coffee longer than necessary, the spoon clinking against the ceramic in the awkward silence that followed. His partner of 3 years, Officer Rodriguez, caught up with him in the parking lot after shift. "Hey, man," Rodriguez said, falling into step beside him. "You want to grab a burger? Talk about what happened." Chen almost said no, but the genuine concern in his partner's voice made him pause. 20 minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner booth of Joe's Diner, their usual after-shift spot. The familiar smell of grilled onions and coffee filled the air, but Chen couldn't bring himself to eat the burger in front of him. "Look," Rodriguez said, leaning forward. "What you did, it wasn't right. You know that. But the chief giving you a second chance, that's huge. Not everyone's happy about it." "You think I don't know that?" Chen pushed his plate away. "The community relations officer won't even schedule my sensitivity training. Says she's too busy." "Because she's worried about how it'll look," Rodriguez explained. "Having the guy who spat on a black man, who turned out to be the new chief, teaching other officers about sensitivity. The local papers would have a field day." Just then, Chen's phone buzzed. It was an email from Chief Washington himself, scheduling a meeting for tomorrow morning. Chen showed it to Rodriguez, who whistled low. "He's really taking this personally, huh?" "Wouldn't you?" Chen asked quietly. The next morning, Chen found himself back in the chief's office. This time, Washington wasn't alone. A woman in her 60s sat in one of the chairs, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and evaluating. "Officer Chen, this is Mrs. Thompson," Washington said. "She runs our community outreach program in the Oak Park neighborhood. You'll be working with her 3 days a week as part of your probation." Chen's stomach dropped. Oak Park was one of the predominantly black neighborhoods in their city. The same community he'd been accused of over-policing multiple times. "Sir, I don't think," Chen started. "That's exactly the problem," Mrs. Thompson cut in, her voice firm but not unkind. "Too many people don't think. They just act on what they feel, what they assume." Washington nodded. "You'll be helping Mrs. Thompson with her youth program. No uniform, no gun, no badge. Just you, learning to see the community you serve as people, not problems." "And if I refuse?" Chen asked, already knowing the answer. "Then you can hand in your resignation," Washington replied simply. That afternoon, Chen found himself walking into the Oak Park Community Center. Kids played basketball in the court outside, their laughter and shouts echoing off the brick walls. Inside, Mrs. Thompson handed him a mop. "Start with the gym floor," she said. "It needs to be clean for tonight's youth meeting." As Chen pushed the mop across the floor, watching kids peek curiously through the doorway at him, he realized this wasn't just about keeping his job anymore. The weight of his actions, the responsibility of this second chance, and the opportunity for real change. It all pressed down on him like a physical thing. A young boy ran in to grab a basketball, stopping short when he saw Chen. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Chen saw something he'd been missing all these years. Not fear, not defiance, just a kid wanting to play basketball in his neighborhood gym. The boy smiled hesitantly. "Are you the new janitor?" "No," Chen replied, managing a small smile back. "I'm just someone learning to do better." 2 weeks into his community service at Oak Park, Chen was starting to see things differently. The community center had become more than just his punishment. It was becoming a place of unexpected lessons. Today, he sat at a worn folding table, helping a 12-year-old boy with his math homework. "I just don't get fractions," the boy, Tommy, sighed, tapping his pencil against the notebook. "Neither did I, at your age," Chen admitted, remembering his own struggles in school. "But you know what? They're just like the basketball court outside. Think of it as dividing the court into parts." Tommy's eyes lit up at the mention of basketball. It was a connection Chen wouldn't have thought to make 2 weeks ago. Back then, he'd seen these kids through the window of his patrol car, making assumptions he now knew were wrong. Mrs. Thompson watched from her office doorway, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. After Tommy left for basketball practice, she called Chen over. "You're different from when you first came here," she said, arranging papers on her desk. "Less stiff. More human." Chen shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I keep thinking about that night. About what I did." "Good." Mrs. Thompson said firmly. But don't let it paralyze you. Let it change you. She pulled out a folder and handed it to him. Inside were letters from community members, complaints about police harassment, stories of discrimination, fears for their children's safety. Chen's throat tightened as he read them. These aren't just papers, Mrs. Thompson said quietly. These are people's lives, their experiences, their truth. One letter caught his eye. A mother writing about her son being stopped 3 times in 1 week while walking home from school. The boy was 14, the same age as Chen's own son. I never thought. Chen started, then stopped, the words sticking in his throat. That's the problem, Mrs. Thompson said. Many don't think about it until they have to. Until something makes them stop and really look. Later that afternoon, Chen helped set up for the community center's weekly dinner. The smell of homemade food filled the air as local families started arriving. He recognized some faces now. The elderly man who played chess in the park, the woman who ran the corner store, kids from the after-school program. A small girl tugged at his sleeve while he was arranging chairs. Mr. Chen, can you help? My brother's stuck on the playground. Without thinking, Chen followed her outside. Her little brother had climbed too high on the jungle gym and was now afraid to come down. Instead of calling for backup or taking control like he would have as an officer, Chen found himself talking softly, encouraging the boy step by step. You're doing great, he called up. Just like when you made that basketball shot yesterday, remember? One step at a time. When the boy finally reached the ground, his sister hugged him tight. Their mother watched from the doorway, and Chen saw something in her eyes he wasn't used to seeing from the community: trust. Back inside, Chief Washington had arrived for his weekly check-in. He stood watching as Chen helped serve food, joke with the kids, and chat with parents. All things that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. Officer Chen, the chief called him over. Walk with me. They stepped outside into the cool evening air. The setting sun painted the basketball court orange, where a few teenagers were still playing. You know, Washington said, watching the game, when I made the decision not to fire you, half the department thought I was crazy. The other half thought I was playing some kind of revenge game. Chen nodded, remembering the whispers and stares. But I've been watching you, Washington continued. Really watching. And you know what I see? I see someone who's finally learning to see people as people. That's not something you can teach in a sensitivity training class. A cheer went up from the basketball court as someone made a three-pointer. Chen found himself smiling, realizing he knew the kid who made the shot. And his story, his dreams, his struggles. I'm starting to understand, sir, Chen said quietly. I'm finally starting to understand. That night, Chen couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, old family photos spread out before him, a cup of cold coffee untouched at his elbow. One photo in particular kept drawing his attention. Himself as a young boy, standing proudly next to his father in their family's small grocery store. He remembered how his father would treat everyone who walked in with the same respectful bow, regardless of their appearance or background. But he also remembered the whispered warnings. Keep an eye on those kids, or watch that group carefully. The mixed messages of his childhood suddenly felt heavy in his chest. His phone buzzed. A text from his teenage son, who lived with his ex-wife. Dad, can we talk? Saw something online about you. Chen's stomach churned. Of course it would find its way online. Of course his son would see it. His fingers hovered over the phone, trying to find the right words. The next morning, he arrived early at the community center, hoping physical work would clear his head. Mrs. Thompson found him organizing the storage room, surrounded by boxes of donated clothes and books. You look like you haven't slept, she observed, helping him sort through a box of children's books. My son found out about what I did, Chen said quietly, placing a book on the wrong shelf before catching himself. He wants to talk about it. Mrs. Thompson sat on a nearby chair, patting the seat next to her. Tell me about your son. He's 15. Smart kid. Better person than I am, that's for sure. Chen sat heavily. I don't know how to explain to him why his father. He trailed off, unable to finish. Sometimes, Mrs. Thompson said, our greatest teachers are our children. They see things more clearly than we do. Later that afternoon, Chen met his son at a small park near the community center. The boy sat on a bench, looking older than Chen remembered, his face serious. Is it true? His son asked without preamble. What they're saying online? Chen took a deep breath. Yes, I did something terrible. Something I'm not proud of. His son was quiet for a long moment. My best friend at school is black. His dad is a doctor. People still follow him around in stores sometimes. The simple observation hit Chen like a punch to the gut. All his years of making excuses, of justifying his behavior, crumbled in the face of his son's straightforward words. I'm learning, Chen said finally. Every day at the community center, I'm learning things I should have known years ago. His son looked at him directly. My friend's dad says it's not enough to just not be racist. You have to be actively anti-racist. Chen felt a surge of pride mixed with shame. His son was teaching him, showing him a better way. Would you like to come to the community center sometime? See what we do there. The boy's face softened slightly. Maybe. Tommy from my math class goes there. He said you've been helping him with fractions. That evening, Chen sat in on a community meeting at the center. Parents discussed their fears about police interactions, their hopes for their children, their dreams for the neighborhood. He listened, really listened, hearing echoes of his own parents' struggles as immigrants, seeing reflections of his own hopes for his son. Chief Washington sat at the back of the room, observing. After the meeting, he approached Chen. Rough night? He asked, noting Chen's tired eyes. Necessary night, Chen replied. Sir, I've been thinking. Those sensitivity training programs you mentioned, maybe they shouldn't just be about teaching officers what not to do. Maybe they should be about this, really seeing people, hearing their stories. Washington nodded slowly. Sounds like you might have some ideas worth sharing, Officer Chen. For the first time in weeks, Chen felt something close to purpose. The shame was still there, but alongside it now grew something else. A determination to turn his mistake into something meaningful, not just for himself, but for his son, for Tommy, for the community he was finally beginning to understand. A month into his probation, Chen found himself in an unexpected place. Sitting across from Chief Washington at the local diner, sharing breakfast before their morning shift. The chief had made it a weekly ritual, though Chen still wasn't sure why. Try the pancakes, Washington said, sliding the syrup across the table. Best in town. The early morning sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across their booth. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few regulars who'd stopped giving them curious looks weeks ago. Sir, Chen began, pushing his eggs around his plate, can I ask you something? Why didn't you just fire me that day? Washington took a long sip of coffee before answering. You know, I've faced people like you used to be my whole career. Some were worse, some better. But firing them never solved anything. Just sent them away angry, their beliefs unchanged. A waitress topped off their coffee cups, and Washington waited until she left before continuing. The hardest part of change isn't making the decision to change. It's doing the actual work. I saw someone who might be willing to do that work. Their conversation was interrupted by Chen's phone buzzing. It was Mrs. Thompson from the community center. There's a situation, she said, her voice tight. One of our kids, Tommy, had a run-in with police this morning. He's pretty shaken up. Chen looked at Washington, who nodded. Go. We'll finish this conversation later. At the community center, Chen found Tommy sitting in Mrs. Thompson's office, his usually bright face drawn and upset. His basketball lay forgotten in the corner. "Want to tell me what happened?" Chen asked, pulling up a chair. Tommy spoke quietly, describing how he'd been stopped and questioned while jogging to early morning basketball practice. The officers had been rough, suspicious, treating him like a criminal despite his gym clothes and basketball. As Chen listened, he felt a familiar sick feeling in his stomach. He could have been one of those officers just a few months ago. Would have been, probably. "You know what the worst part was?" Tommy said, his voice cracking slightly. "They didn't even see me. They just saw." He gestured at himself, unable to finish. Chen remembered Washington's words from breakfast. The hardest part of change is doing the actual work. "Come with me," Chen said suddenly. "Both of you," he added, looking at Mrs. Thompson. 20 minutes later, they walked into the police station. Several officers looked up, surprised to see Chen with a teenager and Mrs. Thompson. Chen walked straight to the chief's office, knocked once, and entered. "Sir, we need to talk about what happened this morning with Tommy." Washington listened as Tommy told his story again. When he finished, the chief was quiet for a long moment. "Officer Chen," Washington said finally, "what would you suggest we do about this?" Chen straightened in his chair. I think Tommy should tell his story at the next department meeting. And not just him. We need to hear from more young people in the community. The officers need to see them as people, not statistics." Washington smiled slightly. "Funny. That's almost exactly what you've been learning at the community center, isn't it?" "Yes, sir. And if these officers are anything like I was, they need to learn it too." Tommy looked between them, confused but hopeful. Mrs. Thompson's eyes shone with pride. "Make it happen," Washington said. "Set up a regular dialogue program. Young people from the community, officers who patrol their neighborhoods. Real conversations, not just presentations." As they left the station, Tommy picked up his basketball from where he'd left it by the door. "Mr. Chen," he said quietly, "thanks for listening. For really listening." Chen watched the boy bounce his basketball as they walked back to the community center. Each bounce seemed to echo with the words that had started his journey. The hardest part of change is doing the actual work. And for the first time, Chen felt ready for whatever work came next. The community dialogue program was going well until the video surfaced. Someone had recorded the incident from that night. Chen spitting on Chief Washington. The shaky phone footage spread across social media like wildfire, and suddenly everything changed. Chen first heard about it from his son, who called him early one morning. "Dad, are you okay? It's everywhere online." Outside the community center that afternoon, reporters gathered with their cameras and microphones. Mrs. Thompson had to escort kids in through the back door to avoid the chaos. Inside, the usual laughter and chatter was replaced with worried whispers. Tommy found Chen in the storage room, organizing donations to keep his hands busy. "My mom says maybe I shouldn't come here anymore," he said quietly. "Some people are saying you shouldn't be working with kids." Chen's heart sank, but before he could respond, Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway. "Officer Chen, you need to see this." In her office, the local news was playing on her small TV. Officers from their own department were being interviewed outside the station. Chen recognized Officer Bryant, someone he'd worked with for years. "We can't trust him anymore," Bryant was saying to the camera. "How can we work with someone who showed such bias? Who's to say he won't do it again?" Other officers nodded in agreement behind him. The reporter turned to the camera. Questions are being raised about Chief Washington's judgment in keeping Officer Chen on the force. Chen switched off the TV, his hands shaking slightly. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should resign. And throw away all the progress you've made." Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "That's the easy way out." Just then, Chief Washington walked in, looking more tired than Chen had ever seen him. "We need to talk." They gathered in the community center's meeting room. Chen, Washington, Mrs. Thompson, and several community leaders who'd been part of the dialogue program. The tension in the room was thick. "The mayor wants your resignation," Washington said directly. "Says it's the only way to calm things down." One of the community leaders, Mr. Brown from the local church, spoke up. "If he resigns, the program dies with him. All this progress, lost." "But if he stays," another leader countered, "people will say we're excusing what he did." Chen looked around the room at these people who'd become more than just faces in the community. He saw Tommy peeking through the window, worry clear on his young face. "I need to speak," Chen said, his voice stronger than he felt. "Not just to the department, but to everyone. No excuses, no hiding." Washington studied him carefully. "You know that means facing everything. All the anger, all the hurt." "Yes, sir, but running away won't fix anything. I know that now." The next morning, Chen stood in front of cameras and microphones outside the police station. His son had insisted on standing beside him, a gesture that filled him with both pride and humility. "2 months ago, I did something unforgivable," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I let anger and prejudice control my actions. I spat on a man, our current police chief, because in that moment, I saw his race before I saw his humanity." He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd, officers, community members, reporters. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to continue the work we've started. Every day at the community center, I learn more about the damage caused by attitudes like the one I held. Every day, I work to be better, to do better." His son squeezed his hand, and Chen drew strength from it. "This isn't about saving my job anymore. It's about showing that real change is possible, but only if we're brave enough to face our mistakes and do the hard work of making things right." Chief Washington stepped forward then, standing beside Chen. The cameras clicked furiously. "The easy path," Washington said to the crowd, "would be to ask for his resignation. The harder path, the right path, is to show that transformation is possible. That's the example we choose to set." A week after the press conference, Chen sat in the police department's largest meeting room, surrounded by fellow officers. The atmosphere was tense. Some officers wouldn't meet his eyes, while others watched him with open hostility. But today wasn't about him. "Thank you all for coming," Chief Washington began. "Today, we're going to do something different. We're going to listen." The doors opened, and in walked Tommy, along with several other teenagers from the community center. Mrs. Thompson followed, giving Chen an encouraging nod. This was the moment they'd been planning for weeks, now more important than ever. Tommy stepped forward first, his hands shaking slightly as he held his notes. "My name is Tommy Williams. Last month, I was stopped by police while going to basketball practice." As Tommy spoke, Chen watched his fellow officers' faces. He saw the same defensive expressions he used to wear, the subtle shifting in seats, the crossed arms. But Tommy's voice grew stronger as he continued, and slowly, those expressions began to change. One by one, other young people shared their stories. Stories of fear, of humiliation, of being treated as suspects in their own neighborhoods. Chen noticed Officer Bryant, who'd spoken against him on TV, uncrossing his arms, his face softening as he listened. When the last teenager finished speaking, the room was quiet. Chief Washington stood up. "Questions?" he asked. Officer Bryant raised his hand, but instead of a question, he spoke directly to Tommy. "I patrol that route to the community center. I've probably driven past you 100 times. Never knew you were heading to practice." "That's kind of the point," Tommy replied quietly. "You see us, but you don't know us." Chen felt something shift in the room. It was the same shift he'd experienced himself at the community center, the moment when people stopped being statistics and became human. He stood up, his heart pounding. "I want to share something too." All eyes turned to him. That video everyone's seen. The one of me at my worst moment. I watch it sometimes. Not because I'm proud of it, but because it reminds me of who I used to be. Chen looked at his fellow officers. We talk about protecting and serving the community. But how can we protect people we don't even try to understand? How can we serve a community we've never really seen? Officer Bryant stood up slowly. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we all do what I was forced to do. Spend time in the community, not as officers, but as people. Learn names, hear stories, show up at community center events, coach basketball, help with homework. Another officer spoke up. We're already understaffed. We don't have time for. We don't have time not to, Chen interrupted. Every kid in this room could be the next doctor, teacher, or police chief. But right now, they're scared of us. That has to change. Chief Washington stepped forward. Officer Chen has been running a successful program at the community center. I'm making it mandatory for all officers to participate, starting next week. The room erupted in murmurs, but Chen wasn't finished. And one more thing. That video. I want it shown in every police academy class. Not to shame me, but to show that change is possible. That we can be better than our worst moments. Tommy looked at Chen with newfound respect. Mrs. Thompson wiped a tear from her eye. Even some of the officers who'd been avoiding his gaze now looked at him differently. After the meeting, Officer Bryant approached Chen. I said some things on TV. You said what I would have said a few months ago, Chen replied. Bryant nodded slowly. Maybe I could come by the community center sometime. See what this program's all about. As Chen watched his fellow officer walk away, he felt a gentle pat on his shoulder. It was Chief Washington. You know, the chief said with a slight smile, sometimes the best leaders are the ones who had to learn the hardest lessons. 1 year had passed since that fateful night. The community center bustled with activity as people gathered for its first anniversary celebration of the Police Community Partnership Program. Colorful balloons decorated the gym, and the smell of potluck dishes filled the air. Chen stood near the entrance, watching Officer Bryant teaching a group of kids how to dribble basketballs. Who would have thought that his former critic would become one of the program's most dedicated volunteers? Quite a change from last year, Chief Washington said, appearing beside him. They both watched as more officers arrived, not in uniforms, but in casual clothes, greeting community members by name. Remember when this place used to go quiet whenever a cop walked in? Chen smiled, remembering how different things had been. Tommy, now a high school sophomore, rushed over with a newspaper in his hand. Mr. Chen, have you seen this? The local paper had run a front-page story about the program's success. The headline read, From Confrontation to Conversation. How One Police Department Changed Its Culture. Below was a photo of Chen and Tommy playing basketball with other officers and kids. My mom framed it, Tommy said proudly. She says it's proof that people can change. Mrs. Thompson called everyone to gather around the podium she'd set up. The room quieted as she began to speak. A year ago, this program started because of a mistake. A terrible mistake that could have ended careers and divided our community even further. Instead, it became a bridge. Chen felt his son's hand slip into his. His boy had grown taller this past year, but more importantly, he'd grown proud of his father again. Thanks to Officer Chen's willingness to learn and Chief Washington's wisdom in giving him that chance, we've seen real change, Mrs. Thompson continued. Complaints against officers are down 60%. Community trust is up, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. She gestured around the room. The real story is in Officer Bryant coaching our basketball team to the Youth League Championships. It's in Officer Wilson helping with college applications. It's in the weekly dinners where officers and families share meals and stories. Chen looked around at the faces he'd come to know so well. The elderly man who now played chess with rookie officers every Thursday. the corner store owner who kept coffee hot for officers on night patrol, the kids who no longer ran away when police cars drove by. Chief Washington took the podium next. "Officer Chen, would you join me?" Chen walked forward, surprised. The chief held up a small plaque. "This program has been so successful that other departments across the country are asking to implement it. They want to know our secret." Washington smiled. "The secret is simple. Real change starts with one person willing to face their mistakes and do better." He handed Chen the plaque. It read, "Officer Richard Chen, Director of Community Relations and Police Reform Training. You're being promoted," Washington announced. "We want you to expand this program, train other departments. Show them what's possible when we choose understanding over anger, growth over punishment." Chen's hand trembled as he held the plaque. He looked at Tommy, who gave him a thumbs up, at his son, who beamed with pride, at Mrs. Thompson, who nodded with tears in her eyes. "I accept," Chen said, "but on one condition." He turned to face the crowd. "That we never forget how this started. That we keep that video, keep my mistake visible, not as a mark of shame, but as proof that the worst moment in someone's life doesn't have to define them forever." As applause filled the room, Chen felt Chief Washington's hand on his shoulder. "You know," the chief said quietly, "that night when I stopped you, I never imagined we'd end up here." Chen looked at the room full of officers and community members laughing together, sharing food, telling stories. "Neither did I, sir. Neither did I." In that moment, Chen realized that his journey hadn't just changed him. It had changed an entire community. And this was just the beginning.